Who is Vice President J.D. Vance? Is he a true Trump believer or is he a shrewd opportunist? How did a guy who once wrote with nuance and eloquence about both ends of this country, the left behind working class and the so-called out-of-touch elites, a man who expertly diagnosed Donald Trump's appeal as cultural heroin, go from thoughtful conservative to MAGA brute? A politician who, on the cruelty scale, often out-Trumps Trump. George Packer of The Atlantic tried to figure it out. He joins us now. George, really good to have you. This was a fascinating read. I just, you go through the evolution of J.D. Vance, and you come to the conclusion that it's kind of hard to tell who he is. Explain.
Yeah, I don't think there's any real answer to the question of how authentic was his transformation from sort of thoughtful, moderate conservative memoirist to fire-breathing culture warrior for MAGA and for Trump. There's two different versions. The sort of generous version says he changed his mind about tariffs, about immigration, and about Trump because he saw Trump trying to help the region, the people, the post-industrial heartland that produced J.D. Vance. And he realized he had to make his peace with Trump in order to help his own people when he went into politics. And then there's the cynical view that when Trump was elected in 2016, Vance saw that his ambitions were blocked because he had called Trump cultural heroin and now was frozen out of the only path available to an ambitious Republican, and so he had to atone. And I don't think it's possible to say where is the genuine Vance. What's more interesting to me, and he really is an interesting figure, is how almost like a character in a novel, he holds a mirror up to the society that produces him at every phase of his life, from his so-called hillbilly origins and his life as the son of a kind of declining family and a declining region in Ohio, to the Marine Corps in Iraq, to the Ivy League and the elite world of Yale Law School and Silicon Valley, and great success with his book, to MAGA and to Trump world. At each step, you see him succeeding while the country is failing. And that, to me, is the real story of J.D. Vance, that he has risen as we've fallen. And in a way, regardless of how authentic his conversion was, it was almost inevitable that he would end up there because that's where we've gone.
It also raises the question of where you think he's going next. You write that he is the clearest next step for Republicans. I mean, he probably will run again if Donald Trump doesn't try to remain in office and run for president, and he would be the one taking the helm. If he is somebody that, it changes or goes wherever the wind blows, who is he in 4 years?
It does depend in part on Trump. First of all, will Trump tolerate someone in his own White House launching a presidential campaign right under his nose while Trump is president and doesn't seem to want to ever be anything else? And second, how does Trump's presidency play out? How popular is he by the end of it? Which means how popular is J.D. Vance, his vice president? So Trump, in a way, Vance's future is still in Trump's hands. What would Vance be as president? I can't say, but I think that he has found a real voice for himself, a kind of liberating voice in being unleashed, in being willing to get into profane fights on social media and to stick a finger in the face of the Ukrainian president and to demonize and stigmatize large groups of his fellow Americans. I think that he seems liberated to do those things, as if the hillbilly elegy Vance was someone who had sort of been civilized by his experience in the meritocracy, in the Ivy League among elites, but who was never entirely comfortable with that, and maybe was increasingly disgusted by the role he was put in, having to explain the pathologies of his own people to super rich CEOs over dinner. I think by the end of those years, he wanted something else. He didn't want to be the mouthpiece who explained one half to the other.
What I found so interesting is there were moments in reading the article where I felt like I really understood the evolution. I understood the distaste. I understood the discomfort. I understood looking at maybe the elites and thinking to yourself, you know, they think that they are setting up programs to help people, but they're not. It's not working. I'm tired of this. I get that. But then he goes and he, instead of the elites, cosseted world of Harvard and Yale and whatnot, law school, he goes to another billionaire class, another elite class. He goes to the Peter Thiels. And Peter Thiel is of the mind of, you know, let's just blow this whole thing up and see what happens. Doesn't work. Democracy doesn't work. Let's blow it all up. And Peter Thiel is somebody who could leave and go to New Zealand if the country, you know, becomes a complete disaster. So is J.D. Vance just using the Peter Thiels? Or does he also believe in the blow it up and I'll find a better place to go if this place is no longer hospitable? I'll go to Mars.
Or more likely is Peter Thiel using J.D. Vance. I think Vance has shown a deep concern with the fate of the people who raised him, who he grew up with, what he calls his people in Hillbilly Elegy. I think that's authentic. But he also seems driven by a kind of contempt for the do-gooders who read Hillbilly Elegy and who thought, oh, now we really understand this world because J.D. Vance has explained it to us. Well, it may be that J.D. Vance was explaining it to people who felt a sort of secret contempt for that world. And there's a few incidents that he's described in which some rich person at dinner says, I don't really care about the working class. I want to have low-wage workers in my hotels, and so I want illegal immigration. Or, you know, why should I care about American workers more than foreign workers? And suddenly Vance has this epiphany that he is being manipulated by people who actually might feel contempt for the world that J.D. Vance came from. And that changes him into a sort of fire breather who goes after the childless cat ladies and Haitian immigrants. And it's as if his moral restraints have been taken off. And there's no limit now to how far he'll go in order to push what he keeps claiming is the interests of the working class. But that seems to me more and more to be just a kind of all-purpose justification for any kind of vituperative language and policy and cruelty that seems to serve his interests, because he's landed in a political world, MAGA, that rewards that. And so he had a lot of ground to make up, and he's made it up really quickly.
I want to read two sections. I'm out of time, so I'm going to end it by just reading these two sections. I think your writing is so beautiful, and forgive me for this, or indulge me. You say, in the end, the question of Vance's character, whether his about-face was authentic, is probably unanswerable. Few people are capable of conscious, persistent self-betrayal. A change that begins in opportunism can be more passionate than a lifelong belief, especially when it's rewarded. Ventriloquize long enough and your voice alters. The mask becomes your face. There's also this. He's more handsome but less appealing. And the loss of appeal comes from the fact that, like the movement that now runs the country, he's animated by what he hates. George Packer, it's a beautifully written piece, but it's also a very well-reported piece. Thank you so much for joining us today.